Zoe Carter woke up to the feeling of cold metal beneath her. Her head throbbed, her vision blurry as she forced herself upright. The last thing she remembered was walking to her car after a long, miserable shift at work. Now, she was in a cage. A literal cage, made of shimmering, translucent bars that crackled with energy. She reached out to touch them, but a jolt of electricity snapped at her fingers, making her recoil. A guttural voice echoed through the dimly lit chamber. "Ah, the human is awake!" Zoe turned her head, finally taking in the scene around her. Outside her cage, a group of towering creatures stood watching her. They weren't like anything she had ever seen before, reptilian, but armored, their exoskeletons gleaming under the artificial light. Some had multiple eyes, others had tusks curving from their lower jaws. They wore advanced combat gear, their weapons pulsing with blue light. They were laughing at her. "Pathetic little thing," one of them sneered, nudging the nearest alien with an elbow. "No claws, no fangs, no natural armor. Just soft flesh and fragile bones. They really are the weakest species." Zoe's heart pounded, but not in fear. She had been underestimated plenty of times before. Bosses, ex-boyfriends, even that one time she took on a guy twice her size in a bar fight. Underestimation was something she had grown used to. And now, looking at these smug, scaly warriors, she felt something she probably shouldn't be feeling in a situation like this. Annoyance. One of the aliens stepped forward, taller than the rest, his armor more elaborate, glowing red along the seams. He had the air of a leader. "You, human!" he addressed her, looking down as if she were an insect he had yet to crush beneath his heel. "You are the latest addition to our hunt." The others roared in approval. Zoe sat back against the bars of her cage, pretending to be unimpressed. "Wow! A hunt? You mean like deer season? Or let me guess, I'm the deer?" The leader chuckled, a deep, unsettling sound. "No, little creature. You are something much lower than that. You are the prey. The weakest of the weak." Zoe tilted her head, her fingers idly tracing the inside of her boot. "That's funny," she mused. "Because the way I see it, the only ones who should be worried are the ones who think they've already won." The laughter in the room died down slightly, the aliens exchanging glances. She could feel the shift, that tiny seed of doubt creeping into their minds. Then, in one swift motion, Zoe pulled a knife from her boot. It wasn't anything special, just a combat knife, sleek, sharp, and reliable. The same one she had carried with her every day since her military training. The aliens, upon seeing it, did exactly what she expected them to do. They burst out laughing. "A knife?" One of them wheezed, clutching his stomach as if this was the funniest thing he had ever seen. "She's brandishing a knife against plasma rifles and ion cannons?" Zoe, unfazed, flipped the knife in her hand, watching the light catch the blade. "You're right," she admitted, her voice light, casual. "You guys have all the fancy tech. The shields, the lasers, the armor. But tell me," she leaned forward, her grin sharp, "what happens when your fancy guns run out of power?" Silence. The alien's amusement wavered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed the leader's face, but he recovered quickly. "We shall see how long your confidence lasts," he said, motioning to one of the others. With the push of a button, the bars of her cage vanished. Zoe barely had time to react before the floor beneath her shifted. The world tilted, and she dropped. She landed hard on her feet in dense, unfamiliar terrain. Trees towered overhead, their bark an unnatural shade of violet. The ground was damp and uneven, thick roots snaking beneath the soil. Above her, the artificial sky flickered, revealing the metal ceiling of the alien ship's hunting arena. The sound of mechanical clicks echoed from hidden speakers. "The hunt begins," the voice of the leader boomed. Zoe rolled her shoulders, adjusting to the surroundings. She could hear them now, the hunters spreading out, moving through the trees with a practiced ease. They expected her to run, to cower, to wait for them to find her. Instead, Zoe took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the knife, and smiled. She wasn't running. She was hunting them. Far off, a pair of alien hunters whispered in their native tongue, moving with the confidence of warriors who had never known defeat. One of them, a brute twice the size of the others, sniffed the air and sneered. "This will be over fast." His companion nodded. "She won't last 10 minutes. A rustling sound made them both pause. The brute turned his head just in time to catch a blur of movement. Something was coming. No. Someone. A figure dropped from the trees, landing behind them without a sound. The brute barely had time to react before he felt something cold press against his exposed neck. His breath hitched. The small, insignificant human had somehow gotten behind them. "Hey there," Zoe murmured, her voice laced with amusement. She pressed the blade just enough to make a point. "Here's the thing," she continued, as the brute stiffened. "I know you guys think I'm just some helpless little human. And honestly, I was really hoping you'd keep thinking that." The second alien reached for his weapon, but he wasn't fast enough. Zoe moved in a blur, slashing at the power pack on his chest. Sparks erupted as his shield shorted out. He staggered back, eyes wide. The brute tried to swing at her, but Zoe was already gone, ducking low and slicing across his leg. He roared in pain, collapsing to one knee. Zoe stepped back, twirling the knife between her fingers. "You brought me here thinking I was just another trophy. But here's the thing about humans." The brute panted, gripping his bleeding leg. He glared at her. "What thing?" Zoe grinned, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "We don't like being underestimated." She vanished into the trees before they could recover, leaving them humiliated, injured, and, most importantly, afraid. Somewhere in the distance, the leader of the hunters listened to the reports coming in. His warriors were supposed to be taking down their prey, but instead, he was hearing about ambushes. Injuries. Losses. A frown settled on his face as he stared at the live feed from his wrist display. It showed blurry footage of a human moving like a ghost, too fast to track. A human who had, somehow, turned the hunt against the hunters. He clenched his jaw. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The prey was fighting back. And worse. She was winning. Zoe crouched low, pressing herself against the thick bark of an alien tree, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. The eerie glow of the artificial sky overhead pulsed in irregular waves, casting shifting shadows across the dense jungle-like terrain. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the unmistakable sounds of the hunters regrouping, their voices carrying through the trees, sharp and irritated. They had expected her to run. Instead, she had humiliated them. And now they were angry. She smirked. Good. Carefully, she adjusted her grip on the knife, her only weapon, the only thing standing between her and whatever twisted game these aliens had planned for her. It wasn't much, not against energy rifles and advanced tracking systems, but if there was one thing she had learned during survival training, it was that a good knife was better than a gun when used right. Guns ran out of ammo. Knives didn't. A branch snapped nearby. Zoe stilled, muscles tensing as she peered through the underbrush. 2 hunters were approaching, moving cautiously, their weapons drawn. Their heavy boots barely made a sound, a testament to their skill. These weren't just some mindless grunts. They were professionals. Zoe let them pass, keeping herself hidden in the thick shadows, her heart pounding in her ears. As soon as they were a few feet away, she moved. Silent as a whisper, she darted forward, catching the last one in their group completely off guard. She clamped a hand over his mouth, yanking him back into the darkness before he could even think to react. The blade of her knife found the soft spot between his armor plates, slipping in with surgical precision. He stiffened, letting out a muffled grunt before going limp in her grip. She lowered his body carefully, ensuring not a single noise betrayed her actions. One down. The second hunter turned just in time to see his fallen companion, his eyes widening. Before he could react, Zoe was already on him. She ducked under his outstretched arm, her knife slicing through the wiring of his weapon, shorting it out in a shower of sparks. He roared, reaching for his sidearm, but Zoe was faster. She drove the handle of her knife into his jaw, snapping his head back with a sickening crack. He collapsed, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Zoe wiped the blade on her sleeve and exhaled. 2 down. Stepping over their bodies, she crouched and pried one of their communication devices from a gauntlet. She twisted the dial, cycling through frequencies until she found the one she was looking for. Static crackled for a moment before a voice came through. Still no visual on the target. The others have gone silent. We need reinforcements. Zoe grinned and pressed the button. Hey boys, she said, keeping her voice low and mocking. You might want to check on your friends. They're taking a little nap. Silence. Then chaos erupted over the frequency. Voices shouted over one another, commands barked, orders given. She's using the trees. She's taking us out one by one. Regroup at Sector 4 now. Zoe clicked off the comms and chuckled. It was almost too easy. They were panicking. And panic made people sloppy. Keeping low, she moved deeper into the artificial jungle, navigating the uneven terrain with practiced ease. She needed a plan. Picking them off one by one was fun, but it wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later they'd adapt. And when that happened, she needed to be 10 steps ahead. As she moved, she spotted something that made her pause. A piece of alien tech lay abandoned near the base of a massive tree, its screen blinking weakly. She picked it up, inspecting it carefully. A holographic map flickered to life, displaying a detailed layout of the hunting grounds. Jackpot. Zoe studied the glowing lines, tracing the pathways with her finger. The arena wasn't just a random jungle. It was a controlled environment with designated zones, supply caches, and most importantly, an exit. She wasn't supposed to know about that part. The hunters had assumed she wouldn't last long enough to even consider escaping. That was their mistake. She memorized the route before pocketing the device and moving forward. Every instinct told her she was being watched. She was right. A shadow moved in her peripheral vision. Zoe spun, but not fast enough. A force slammed into her from behind, knocking her to the ground. The impact stole the breath from her lungs, her knife skidding out of reach. A massive alien loomed over her, his deep-set eyes gleaming with triumph. He was larger than the others, his armor thicker, his posture confident. He had been waiting for her to make a mistake. And she had. Zoe struggled, but his grip was iron. He pressed a knee into her back, pinning her down effortlessly. You are impressive for a human, he admitted, his voice a guttural growl. But the game is over. Zoe coughed, tasting blood in her mouth. Is it? With all her strength, she shifted her weight, rolling just enough to slip a hand into her boot. The alien didn't notice, until it was too late. In a blur of movement, Zoe drove her hidden backup knife into the gap between his armor plates. The alien let out a strangled sound, his grip loosening as pain overtook him. Zoe didn't hesitate. She twisted the blade and shoved him off her, scrambling to her feet just as he collapsed. She retrieved her main knife, standing over his writhing form. You should have killed me when you had the chance, she muttered before disappearing back into the jungle. The rest of the hunters were closing in. She could hear them, the sharp hum of their weapons, the pounding of their boots. They weren't taking chances anymore. Zoe exhaled, centering herself. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was war. She smirked. And she planned on winning. Zoe moved like a ghost through the dense undergrowth, her body low, her breath controlled. Every step she took was deliberate, calculated. She had already turned the hunt against the hunters, but that wasn't enough. She needed to break them. Fear was the best weapon she had, and she planned to use it until these overconfident aliens were questioning every shadow, every rustling leaf, every single breath they took. The calm she had stolen crackled again, but this time, there was no panicked shouting. Just tense silence before the voice of the leader Zephyr came through. Regroup and adapt. The human is not to be underestimated. Zoe smirked. About time they figured that out. She pressed the calm button and whispered, That's the smartest thing you've said all day. The silence on the other end was almost satisfying. She imagined their faces, the flicker of doubt, the realization that they weren't dealing with some helpless little creature to be toyed with. She clicked off the comm before they could trace her location and pressed on, her eyes scanning the jungle with sharp precision. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, the quiet more oppressive than before. The aliens weren't just reacting anymore. They were planning. Setting a trap. Zoe knew the feeling. She had walked into enough ambushes in her time to recognize the signs. She slowed her pace, ducking behind a massive tree trunk. Carefully, she pulled herself up, climbing to a higher vantage point. From the branches, she had a clearer view of the terrain ahead. That's when she saw it. A clearing, too open, too exposed. No way around it. And in the center of it, a small device sat on the ground, blinking in rhythmic pulses. A lure. They wanted her to go for it. They wanted her to think it was something valuable, something that could help her. But it was bait. The real trap was in the trees surrounding it. Zoe smiled to herself. Nice try. She reached into her pocket, feeling the smooth, cool surface of the alien map she had taken earlier. A little tweak to the settings, a quick adjustment to the frequency, and suddenly, the holographic projection of herself flickered into life, standing in the clearing exactly where the hunters wanted her. The moment it appeared, energy blasts erupted from the surrounding trees, streaks of blue and green plasma slicing through the air. The barrage was relentless, tearing into the ground, the trees, scorching the terrain where they believed she stood. Zoe stayed perfectly still, perched above them, watching as the realization dawned. Their shots had hit nothing. The barrage slowed. Confused murmurs filled the comms. And then chaos. Zoe dropped down behind them, knife in hand. The first alien didn't even have time to turn before her blade cut clean through the exposed tubing along his neck. He crumpled without a sound. The second heard the noise and spun, bringing his rifle up, but Zoe was already moving, twisting under his arm, kicking his knee inward with brutal precision. As he stumbled, she grabbed the back of his head and drove it hard into a nearby tree. He went limp instantly. The remaining two were faster. One of them fired wildly in her direction, forcing her to roll out of the way. She felt the heat of the plasma singe the air just above her shoulder. She darted behind another tree, pressing herself flat against it as the last two hunters hesitated. They weren't charging. They weren't chasing her blindly. They were waiting. She could hear them whispering, planning, trying to force her into a mistake. Smart. Didn't matter. Zoe grabbed a small stone from the ground and hurled it in the opposite direction. The moment it struck the brush, both aliens turned, raising their weapons. It was all the distraction she needed. She moved fast, cutting through the space between them before they even realized they had been tricked. Her knife found its mark, slipping under the armor of the first hunter, severing the tendons in his arm before he could react. His weapon clattered to the ground. The last one tried to grab her, but Zoe ducked, using his own momentum against him, flipping him over her shoulder. He hit the ground hard, his breath leaving him in a ragged gasp. Before he could recover, her knife was at his throat. He stilled, his breath ragged, his wide eyes flickering between her and the bodies of his fallen companions. "You're scared," she observed, tilting her head slightly. "Good." He didn't respond, but she could see it in the way his body tensed, the way his fingers twitched against the dirt. Zoe leaned in slightly, her voice a whisper. "Tell Cypher something for me. Tell him the human he thought was prey is coming for him." She stepped back, allowing the terrified alien to scramble to his feet and run. She knew he would deliver the message. And that was exactly what she wanted. Cypher watched the feed from the control room, his jaw tightening. This was not how things were supposed to go. The human had taken down half of his squad, and worse, she had humiliated them in the process. His grip tightened on the edge of the console as the remaining warriors stood around him, waiting for orders. "She's toying with us," one of them muttered. "She's treating this like a game." Cypher turned, his expression cold. "Then we change the rules." A holographic panel flickered to life, revealing a massive, reinforced chamber deep within the ship. The pit. The place where only the most dangerous of creatures were released. The ones meant to tear apart anything in their path. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the speakers as the containment doors rumbled. Cypher's lips curled into a smirk. Let's see how well the human fights when she's not the one doing the hunting. Zoe felt the shift in the air before she heard the sound. A low, unnatural growl that vibrated through the ground beneath her feet. The jungle around her fell silent, the usual hum of unseen creatures disappearing entirely. She turned slowly. The trees in front of her trembled as something massive moved through them. A predator. Something they had just unleashed specifically for her. Her grip on the knife tightened, but she smiled anyway. Well, she muttered to herself, rolling her shoulders. This should be interesting. Zoe barely had time to react before the trees in front of her exploded outward, splinters flying in every direction as the massive creature crashed through the undergrowth. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, towering, covered in thick, chitinous plates that pulsed with an eerie bioluminescent glow. Its elongated head bore jagged, overlapping mandibles that snapped together with a sickening clack. The moment its milky white eyes locked onto her, Zoe felt a shift in the air. This wasn't just another alien predator. This thing was engineered to kill. And it had just been unleashed for one reason: to rip her apart. She bolted. The creature roared, a deep, bone-rattling sound that sent birds and smaller creatures fleeing in terror. Zoe ducked low, weaving through the dense terrain, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted between the massive trunks. The alien jungle blurred around her, her only focus on putting distance between herself and the monster crashing through the foliage behind her. She could hear it, hear the weight of its massive body tearing through trees like they were nothing, gaining on her with terrifying speed. A fallen log loomed ahead, and Zoe leapt, rolling over it just as the creature's claws swiped where she had been a second earlier. She hit the ground in a crouch and glanced back. The beast reared up on its hind legs, its mandibles spreading wide as a thick, viscous saliva dripped from its maw. It let out a clicking growl, watching her, calculating. It wasn't just chasing blindly. It was learning. Zoe's mind raced. Running wouldn't work forever. She had to take control of the fight. Spinning on her heel, she changed direction, darting toward a cluster of massive, twisted roots jutting from the ground. If she could just use the terrain against it. The moment she reached the roots, she pivoted and turned, throwing her knife with deadly accuracy. The blade embedded itself deep in the creature's shoulder, piercing just under the armored plating. The beast roared in rage, but not in pain. The wound barely slowed it down. Zoe cursed under her breath. That should have done more damage. The creature lunged. She dove to the side just as its massive claws smashed into the spot where she had been standing, sending dirt and debris flying. Rolling to her feet, she snatched up a jagged piece of metal, a remnant of one of the previous hunter's equipment, and gripped it like an improvised weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The monster turned toward her again, huffing, snarling, its muscles coiling in preparation for another attack. But Zoe had already noticed something. It wasn't just fast. It was precise. Too precise. Her eyes darted to the base of its skull, where a series of metallic nodes pulsed faintly in rhythm with its movements. It wasn't just a predator. It was controlled. Cypher. Zoe wiped the sweat from her brow, exhaling sharply. If this thing was being controlled remotely, then it had weaknesses. She just had to find them before it tore her apart. The monster lunged again, but this time, Zoe didn't run. She sidestepped, spinning with calculated precision, slashing across one of the metallic nodes with the jagged piece of metal she held. Sparks erupted from the wound, and the creature let out a shriek, stumbling forward as its movements faltered for the briefest of moments. That was it. That was the opening she needed. She sprinted forward, climbing up its massive back before it could react. Gripping onto the armored plating, she pulled herself toward its neck, her hands scrambling for the exposed cluster of nodes just beneath its skull. The beast bucked wildly, trying to throw her off. Zoe held on with everything she had, her muscles burning as she reached for her knife still lodged in its shoulder. With one final pull, she yanked it free and drove it straight into the largest node. The effect was immediate. The creature's body spasmed violently, its roar turning into a guttural, distorted wail as the connection severed. Its eyes flickered, confusion and panic flashing across its grotesque features before its massive body collapsed. Zoe barely managed to roll off in time before it crashed into the ground, sending a cloud of dust into the air. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the lifeless body of the beast. The once fearsome predator now lay still, its form twitching occasionally from the last residual sparks of its severed control link. A slow, mocking clap echoed through the trees. Zoe turned sharply, her grip on the knife tightening as Zephyr emerged from the shadows, flanked by two of his remaining elite hunters. He looked down at the fallen creature, then back at Zoe, his expression unreadable. "Impressive," he mused, his voice laced with amusement. "You are far more resourceful than I anticipated." Zoe wiped her blade against her pants, her eyes never leaving him. "Yeah? Well, you're a lot dumber than I expected." One of his hunters snarled, stepping forward, but Zephyr held up a hand, stopping him. "You misunderstand, human," Zephyr continued, tilting his head slightly. "This was never about testing your strength. It was about testing your value." Zoe frowned, her instincts on high alert. "What the hell does that mean?" Zephyr smiled, a slow, unsettling expression that made her stomach twist. "It means," he said, "that we no longer wish to hunt you." The air around them seemed to shift, the tension crackling like static electricity. "We wish to recruit you." For the first time since this nightmare began, Zoe found herself caught off guard. A sharp laugh escaped her lips, raw and disbelieving. "You want me to work for you?" Zephyr's smile didn't waver. "We are warriors, not fools. You are a survivor. A strategist. You have turned the hunt against us, something no creature before you has ever done. We could use someone like you." Zoe narrowed her eyes. "And if I say no?" Zephyr sighed as if he had expected the question. "Then we will be forced to kill you, of course." Zoe glanced at the two elite hunters beside him, both armed to the teeth, their weapons glowing faintly in the dim light. She was good, but she wasn't stupid. Taking all three of them head-on in her current condition would be suicide. She exhaled slowly, considering her options. Then, with a smirk, she shrugged. "All right," she said. "I'll think about it." Zephyr's eyes gleamed with approval. "A wise choice." Zoe took a step forward, then immediately lunged. She was fast, faster than any of them expected. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the stolen comm device from her pocket and slammed it against Zephyr's chest, activating the distress beacon she had rewired earlier. The effect was instant. An explosion rocked the ground beneath them as an emergency override activated deep within the ship, triggering a ship-wide lockdown. Alarms blared. Lights flickered. And in the chaos, Zoe ran. She didn't look back. Not as Zephyr shouted in rage. Not as the jungle around her dissolved into complete anarchy. Not as she sprinted toward the only thing that mattered now. Her escape. Zoe ran through the chaos, dodging the flashing red warning lights and the pulsing beams of alien weaponry as the ship descended into madness. The emergency override she had triggered had done exactly what she hoped. It had thrown everything into disarray. Doors slammed shut. Security measures malfunctioned. The once organized hunting grounds now turned into a battlefield where even the hunters were struggling to navigate the collapsing structure. She didn't stop. She couldn't. The moment she hesitated, she knew Zephyr would be right behind her, and she had no intention of sticking around to see what he had planned next. The control room was her only chance. If she could get there, she could override the ship's navigation, force an emergency landing, or, at the very least, cause enough havoc to find an escape pod. She didn't know where the ship would land. She didn't care. As long as it wasn't here. The ground beneath her feet trembled, a sign that whatever self-destruct protocols she had triggered were not just for show. The entire ship was unstable now. She could hear the hunters shouting over the comms, trying to regain control, but it was too late. They had been too focused on the hunt, too sure of themselves. And now, the prey was tearing apart their home from the inside. She reached a corridor that was lined with control panels, their displays flickering wildly as the ship's AI struggled to maintain stability. Footsteps thundered behind her. Zoe didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You're only making this worse for yourself." Zypher's voice echoed through the halls, steady despite the chaos. "You had a chance. You could have joined us. Now you'll die here like the rest of them." Zoe smirked, slamming her fist into a nearby console and overriding another lock. The doors ahead of her hissed open, revealing the bridge of the ship, her way out. "Yeah, well," she called over her shoulder. "I have a habit of not dying when I'm supposed to." She bolted through the doors and into the control center, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar alien controls. Symbols flickered across the main screen, the ship's AI struggling to correct its course. She didn't have time to figure out the language. She just needed one button. One control. Then she saw it. A blinking panel near the main console, the emergency drop sequence. A last resort? If triggered, it would detach the hunting ship's lower sections, sending the entire artificial hunting ground plummeting toward the nearest planet. The ship itself would remain intact, but everything below would be obliterated. She didn't hesitate. She slammed her fist onto the panel. Alarms shrieked through the ship as the emergency sequence engaged. The ground beneath her rumbled as the lower half of the vessel began to detach. Zypher's voice roared in fury just as the doors to the bridge slammed open. He was fast. Faster than she expected. 1 second, she was reaching for a control lever to stabilize the pod system. The next, Zypher had closed the distance, slamming her into the console with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. "You are not leaving," he snarled, his grip tightening around her wrist. Zoe gritted her teeth, twisting in his grip. "You're right," she wheezed. "I'm not leaving alone." With her free hand, she drove her knife up into his side, twisting the blade between the segmented plates of his armor. Zypher's grip faltered, just enough for Zoe to break free. She shoved him back, lunging for the escape pod control panel. His foot hooked around her ankle, yanking her off balance. She crashed to the ground, rolling just in time to avoid the plasma blade that sliced through the air where her head had been. Zypher was on her again in an instant, his eyes burning with rage. "You think you can survive out there?" he sneered, pressing down against her with his full weight. "You think you're anything more than an anomaly? A mistake?" Zoe grinned, blood staining her teeth. "I think," she gasped, "that you talk too much." She brought her knee up, hard, straight into his stomach. Zypher staggered, just long enough for Zoe to grab a fallen plasma rifle from the floor. She didn't know how to use it. She didn't care. She pressed the trigger and let the energy blast rip straight through the control panel behind him. Sparks exploded as the emergency pods fired to life. The force of the blast sent Zypher stumbling backward, his eyes widening as the platform beneath them began to separate. Zoe didn't give him time to recover. She sprinted forward, grabbing onto the edge of the escape pod's entrance just as the ship lurched. Zypher lunged, but the last thing Zoe saw before the hatch sealed shut was the look of pure rage on his face as the floor beneath him gave way, sending him plummeting into the chaos below. The pod shot forward, rattling violently as it entered the planet's atmosphere. Flames licked at the edges of the window, the force of gravity pressing Zoe back against the seat. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. For the first time since this nightmare started, she allowed herself to feel it. Relief. The pod crashed into the surface with a violent jolt, skidding through dense terrain before finally coming to a halt. Zoe groaned, pushing herself upright. The emergency lights flickered as the pod's door hissed open, revealing a strange, alien landscape beyond. She was alive. But she wasn't home. She staggered out onto the unfamiliar soil, taking in the sight of a massive, neon-lit city in the distance. Towering structures reached toward the sky, ships of all sizes hovering above the sprawling metropolis. This wasn't Earth. It wasn't the hunting ground either. It was something else entirely. Footsteps approached from behind her. Zoe turned sharply, knife still in hand, ready for another fight. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, silhouetted against the neon glow of the distant city. Not a hunter. Something else. You made quite the entrance, the figure said, voice laced with amusement. Zoe tightened her grip on the blade. That depends. Are you here to kill me or help me? The figure chuckled. That depends, they replied. How much trouble are you planning to cause? Zoe smirked, wiping the blood from her face. As much as possible. She slid the knife back into her boot and took a step forward, toward the unknown. Because one thing was certain. Her hunt wasn't over yet.